Conversation with a Geographer. I'm Mike DeVivo, professor of geography at Grand Rapids Community College, and today we have Craig Colten, professor emeritus at Louisiana State University. Craig, we're really fortunate to have you here. Thank you so much for coming to share this time with us.
Mike, I'm really pleased. I mean, I've known you for quite a number of years now. It's really a pleasure to be able to sit down and have a chat with you today.
It's great. Craig, as I start many of these interviews, I'm going to ask you, what really put you on the path to pursue geography? Was it anything in your childhood? And can you comment about, where you were raised and where you studied?
I grew up in a fairly small city in North Louisiana, and my parents were both carpetbaggers. I mean, they were from the North. They came down, so we had no relatives within 1,000 miles. So whenever we went to visit family, we had to drive across the country for the most part. So that was one way of kind of opening my eyes beyond my little hometown, that, man, you drive to Illinois or Michigan or go visit relatives in Utah or New Jersey. And I traveled a lot more than many of my contemporaries from my hometown. So I had an opportunity as a very young child to, have my horizons broadened significantly. And then when I was a senior in high school, I decided I had to learn to fly an airplane. So I got my pilot's license, which exposed me to meteorology and, map reading and all those kind of things. Then I went off to college at the University of Tulsa, dropped out rather promptly. So I'm a college dropout who found my way back to this. But when I started looking to go back to school, I found in college catalogs, they offered courses like air photo interpretation, meteorology, generally in geography departments.
Sure.
So that's what really pulled me or directed me into a geography department, was deciding to go back to college and not major in something really foolish like business administration, which is where I started, and do something that I was really interested in. And I thought would give me a connection with something I was kind of have an avid interest in, which was flying, and the things you had to know to be a competent pilot. So that's how I got back into geography. And interestingly enough for you, the two places I really looked at were the University of Tennessee and LSU. And I went to LSU, as it turned out.
Which was a great choice.
Oh, it really was. I mean, it was really an exceptional situation. I stumbled into a really great department. I started off more in a physical geography track with the interest in meteorology, climatology, and air photo interpret. And I did all those courses, but the two people who really were inspirational to me were Sam Hilliard, who did historical geography, and Milton Newton, who's one of the most brilliant geographers I've ever met, who has long since passed away.
Sure.
And passed away at a fairly early age.
Do you think
but he was just really had the most Catholic interest and was just an amazingly intelligent person.
Very, very, very universal in terms of the knowledge that he had. And I wonder, do you think that Niffen regarded him as his best student?
I wouldn't be surprised. I never had that conversation with Niffen. I mean, he was still there when I was a student, but he was such an august figure. As an undergraduate, you didn't approach, the grand old man. But
no, he was still in his office. I mean, almost
daily,
every day.
Daily,
and,
yeah.
And he was very benevolent with his time. He'd sit on that stool there and he would talk to you and really, really enrich your life by giving his time.
Yeah. He always said that he never repeated the same class. Like, he would prepare fresh notes for every class, year after year. I don't know how much it was from scratch, or if he just kind of updated the notes from the previous year, which is certainly what I would have done. But, the fact that LSU hired Milton Newton, he got his PhD with Niffen at LSU, and then he worked on the faculty there. That's really a rare situation. And I think Niffen had the clout to make that happen.
Sure. And Hilliard and Niffen collaborated on a textbook, if I remember correctly.
Wasn't it?
Yeah.
It wasn't a direct collaboration.
Louisiana Geography?
Niffen had done the book, and then Hilliard did an update, but left Niffen's name on it.
Gotcha.
It was kind of a courtesy. Because Niffen had really done the entire book, and Sam Hilliard just updated it and really couldn't claim it was his in its entirety.
Mm-hmm. Well,
so then some colleagues of mine and I, we took up a more recent version of that. We didn't base it on the original Louisiana geography text, but I was co-author of a subsequent Louisiana geography text.
Well, there's certainly been a lot of changes, very rapid changes, one would think, over the last few decades, especially with regard to coastal matters. And also, in line with some of your interest, the matter of toxic waste and pollutants and things of that nature. But let's get back to LSU for a minute. In those days, you were a graduate student. So you were a student of Hilliard's. Were you engaged in your master's research? Were you not?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. And he certainly had a great sense of humor and was very approachable, it seemed. Did you have any recollection of any particular events or notions of how he communicated with students or taught in the classroom?
Well, Sam was really great. He would kind of patrol the halls, and he'd stop and chat with people and have tell jokes, and he'd love it if you brought him a kind of an off-color joke but the funny thing is, he got in, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. He once told some undergraduates, he in one of his introductory geography classes, he told the students that his idea of the ultimate event in a professor's life was to be to have some young woman and a cocktail waitress will come in and interrupt his class and hand him a martini. Well, I got to be friends with two young women who were students in a class when he announced that. So basically, my last semester as a master's student, we brought one of those students in hot pants and big clothes and flashy satin blouse, and she came in with a martini on a tray, and he just looked and he goes, "Oh God, it's great to be an American." And he tosses back this martini. I don't think it was a real martini, but he tosses it back and he says, "I can't go on. Class is dismissed."
I recall him administering the historical geography specialty group meetings, at AAG meetings, and he would certainly make comments about the political situation in Louisiana with regard to the Edwards. Once he's elected to be the chair of the group and things of that nature. Very humorous character. Did he ever talk about his work as a doctoral student under Andy Clark?
Not so much. I mean, he had a really interesting background. He was really kind of a late bloomer in terms of getting into the academy, and he was an electrician. He worked, doing electrical work before he became a PhD student. And then, but he never really, we never had any real conversations about that. About his PhD experience. But that was a time when Clark was putting out students who are ending up at the top universities all over the country. It must have just been a pretty heady time to be a student there.
He and Hilliard went to Southern Illinois University before LSU.
Yeah, he spent a few years there. And he spent a few years there, and he published his dissertation book with SIU
Hog Meat
Press.
and Hoe Cake. Really, really good stuff. So, you certainly had developed a firm foundation in historical geography before you went on to Syracuse then for your doctorate. Why don't you comment on that experience in Syracuse, if you don't mind?
Sure. Syracuse was a very, very different place than LSU. There was
no martinis in the classroom, huh?
No, nobody. There wasn't much room for frivolity, and I got in trouble a couple of times for playing pranks on people. And I mean, it was probably more important there than it was at LSU. But I used to perform, play guitar and sing and stuff. And I adopted a stage name so the faculty wouldn't realize I was out doing this, thinking that would, get me, I would fall in standing in terms of their opinion. But and I did a little of that in Syracuse, but it was more just more out of habit. But it wouldn't have undermined my career, I don't think, if I'd let that out. But now the only people who call me by my old stage name are former faculty at LSU. But Syracuse was a little bit more staid. It was really a cold place, and I'm from the South, and the winters were long. And I found that, every time it snowed a little bit, I'd take the afternoon off, go sit down, have a beer. And for the first 2 or 3 weeks of October, this was becoming, every other day. And then I realized, well, I better, revamp my thinking about what you do when it snows, because when it snows in Baton Rouge or even in North Louisiana, everything shuts down. They close everything. So I couldn't adopt that. I had to drop that sort of response to snow. But there were some really good people at Syracuse. I made some really good professional collegial friends who, some of them are still friends today in the profession. It was and mining was really a really inspiration to work with. I mean, he would put in his hours. You made appointments. You didn't just pop in on him. You didn't meet him in the hall and joke around with him, but he was the consummate scholar. And if you went in and had a conversation with him, he'd give you his 100% of his attention. He'd ask good questions and keep you moving on. And so it was not hard to work with him, but there just wasn't, I never really developed the close ties that I had with Sam Hilliard.
So Donald Meinig, who was really the epitome of the historical geographer in the United States and the history of American academic geography. He was very structured, I guess, in terms of his mannerism and also in terms of his relationships. And it would appear that high level of structure enabled him to produce the magnificent body of scholarship that he did.
Yeah, he was very diligent, and one of the greatest things he ever did is he cited my dissertation in one of his volumes of the 4-volume set. I mean, to me, that was the first time, probably the only time that stupid dissertation was ever cited. But he was generous with his students that way. I mean, you might not go out and have a beer with him, but he was generous in other ways. And when I was back up in doing a fall semester at Colgate University, which is about 30, 40 miles from Syracuse a few years ago, and I went up, Don and I had lunches together several times. We'd have a beer for lunch. I mean, it was a very different sort of relationship because I'd gone on and I'd established myself in the profession. And I think he respected that and was willing to treat me as a peer rather than a student. And, so
was he in your view, was he threatening? Was he kind? Was he compassionate? Was he uncaring? Was he caring? Did he give you encouragement? Was he discouraging in some ways? How was he critical? Can you comment on some of those ideas?
Sure. He was never, one bit of it, I think he provided good advice. He wanted you to succeed. We had another historical geographer at Syracuse who would tend to sometimes get on student committees with mining, but he would kind of take his animosity towards mining out through the student. And he advised me not to take this person on, even though I'd done some work that kind of overlapped with his areas of interest. So that was supportive. I saw that as being strictly supportive. He said, take a class with him. He's good, but he's going to try and lock horns with me. He never said in those terms, but it was clear that he was going to. The potential was there for locking horns through the torso of the student. But he was he would provide good sound guidance and advice. He'd read things. You'd give him. The first week I was there, he said, "I want to read your master's thesis," which is something I adopted with all my students who came in to do a PhD. So I thought that was a very generous thing to do. He didn't have to, but he wanted to know a little bit more about me. In classes, he was always thoughtful and asked engaging questions. And even in the dissertation defense process, it was supportive, not critical to be critical. And I've always since then I've strived to make dissertation and thesis defenses constructive conversations as opposed to bashing the work of a student. And I was telling them they need maybe a little deodorant and not Kevlar when they come to the defense.
Wes Dow was an early student of mine. Wes Dow, who was the architect of Geographers on Film, which is really the inspiration for this conversation with the Geographer series. Wes Dow commented to me that he was rarely intellectually intimidated, but Meinig was intellectually intimidating given the universality of his knowledge and just his depth of scholarship and his wisdom. And he said when he completed his dissertation defense under Meinig walked out of the room and just comments to him, "Piece of cake. Piece of cake." Well, great encouraging words I think every student wants to hear after they come out of their dissertation defense.
Yeah, great line, yeah.
It is. Did you take classes with Meinig?
Yeah, he advised me to take his undergraduate historical geography class, which I did. And I just audited. I basically sat in, and I took a seminar with him. But that class was really remarkable because you really saw him in his full flower. I mean, he would draw these maps on the board. Every map was hand drawn. These very simple but clear maps that showed process and movement and the dynamics of the settling of North America. And his eloquence was just extraordinary. I mean, I would never be able to live up to that level of articulateness.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. So many of those students didn't know what kind of gem they had in their education, at Syracuse at that time.
Yeah.
He really did.
Yeah, I mean, he, and as you were saying earlier, I mean, he really in the 80s and into the 90s was probably the dean of historical geography in North America. I mean, Clark had transitioned on from the scene, and Meinig was really the single most important figure. I mean, there are other really great historical geographers. I think Meinig was really the face of historical geography, and he was respected by historians. I mean, to me, that's
absolutely
a really important facet, is that he was not just communicating with geographers, but historians read his work.
He was not only the face of historical geography, but he really served as the interface between the disciplines of history and geography.
Yeah, I think so, more so than anybody. I mean, other people, a lot of people communicate with historians, but more in a kind of a narrow specialty kind of arena than Meinig, who was, seen by the history community at large.
Indeed. So you left Syracuse and then you went to Illinois, right?
Yeah, I spent a decade working for state government after I graduated from Syracuse, and my job was to do research on the historical geography. I was hired as a historical geographer to document industrial practices that led to the disposal of hazardous waste in the states. My first job really was to try to find out if Illinois had a Love Canal on the southeast side of Chicago. That was kind of the unspoken mission that I was assigned. And I worked with an interdisciplinary team. We had hydrologists, people in the natural history survey, which was biologists, and then geologists. There was kind of four of us who were the original core staff of what they called the Hazardous Waste Research and Information Center. We were each based in a separate subdivision of the state's Energy and Natural Resources Department. And we were all in basically research-oriented facilities. I mean, the museum had a big research program, as well as really strong collections and built museum exhibits and interpretations around their collection.
Was this around the time that you became familiar with Altgeld Gardens and the Toxic Donut?
Oh yeah. This was, the first project I did was on Southeast Chicago. Then I did
Right.
East St. Louis and Rockford. I did a series of case studies, but Southeast Chicago was where Altgeld Gardens was. And yeah, that's very much where I became familiar with what was going on there. Is back in the days of the Pullman train car company, where they sent their sewage waste down and dumped it out of the ground. It later became Altgeld Gardens.
I seem to recall, my goodness, it must have been in the mid 80s that there was a historical geography specialty group working paper that you edited and wrote in about applied historical geography and careers in applied historical geography. I have no idea whatever happened to that manuscript, but it seems to me, I referred to it from time to time when I was advising students, and it seems to me it's still rather salient and might use some updating, but it's still an important idea.
Well, I was one of a very few historical geographers with PhDs in historical geography that was working outside the academy in those days. And I really, and I interacted with a lot of historians, and they had a public history organization, and they supported their people who were doing museum work and archival work and those kinds of, but we didn't really have a place for it in geography. And so I was really game and really eager to try to put forward, that there are opportunities beyond the academy, because when I finished, it was one of these really low points in terms of the academic job market. And I was really fortunate. I was lucky to find that job.
Mm-hmm.
A friend of mine who was a neuropsychologist who read Science magazine said, "Craig, you'll love this ad. It's written for you." And I applied for it and got the job. But I would have never seen it had it not been for this young lady who was a friend of mine. But I still feel that we need to train our students to be prepared to go beyond the strict academic setting. And I think I had a PhD student who just finished this past week, who was my first student in about 10 years who took an academic job straight out of graduate school. Most of my students since the early aughts or the early teens have taken private public jobs and not in the academy. So, and they're all doing quite well. I'm really, really proud of those students, and they're contributing in a lot of different ways.
Well,
most of them don't consider themselves historical geographers; they're more environmental geographers.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is something that I'm sure we will find to be more apparent as the years come. I think that the future holds a number of positions open for geographers in the public sector and in the private sector. And there will be fewer positions in many cases in academic institutions, at least those that are permanent, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think it's I thought it was a dark time when I finished. I think it's even a darker time right now for emerging PhD students. And I think some of these jobs can be highly rewarding and have great challenges. And you can do work that's really intellectually solid, and you can excel at that. And I think there's a lot of things geographers can do that other disciplines can't, that position us to serve in these kind of jobs if our students can figure out where to look. And that was part of the purpose of that little short historical geography specialty group publication.
Well, absolutely. And just because someone goes into a non-academic field doesn't mean that there will not be opportunities to go into academia later, like you experienced yourself. You went to Southwest Texas at San Marcos afterward. How long did you spend in San Marcos?
I spent a decade in Illinois, 2 years working for a private consulting company in D.C.
Okay.
And I spent 4 years in Texas. And I would never have been able to make that move from the public/private sector back to the academy had I not had expectations on my job in Illinois to publish and participate in professional organizations, because they were very much a research-oriented group within the museum, that they supported that. And the fact that I had publications made all the difference in the world when I applied to work at Southwest Texas.
And when you went to Texas, if I remember correctly, the only master's degree they offered was a master's in applied geography. So your applied background, I'm sure, must have played a significant role in entering academe through that route.
Yeah, without a doubt. I mean, that was very much, that was an incredibly good fit with what was Southwest Texas at the time, now Texas State. But that the fact that I had that experience plus a sound publication record really made me and interested in environmental topics that meshed with what they were trying to build in their PhD program, made me a good, strong candidate.
But then the opportunity arose for you to join the faculty in Baton Rouge, and there you went, and there you stayed.
Yeah, that whole transition is really interesting, because when I got to Texas, they wanted me to do something on Texas. And I went to Houston and had lunch with a friend who's a historian. And I was thinking I'd do an environmental history of Galveston Bay. I thought, what a really fascinating topic. So I sat down to lunch with him, and he started telling me, I'm going to do this environmental history of Galveston Bay. So I said, he's the senior guy here, and this is his turf. I'll let him have it. And so I said, I'll do the same thing in New Orleans. I'll do an environmental history of New Orleans, basically.
Sure.
Which proved to be incredibly important in the long run. But so I always thank this guy, Marty Belosi, now for kind of deflecting me. He doesn't remember the conversation at all, but it really shaped what I would do those 4 years at Texas. And then when I got to Louisiana, I published the book on the eve of Katrina. And it just really exploded in terms of public visibility.
Well, and you were interviewed on NPR, if I remember correctly, along with other news broadcast outlets, which showed really the relevance of historical geographical research. In
I think so.
ways.
I agree. I was called before the winds died down at my home in Baton Rouge by a reporter from the New York Times. And we did an interview. We had no power, but our landline was still working at the time. This was 2005. I didn't have a cell phone yet. And he quoted me, and the next day, then everything broke open, and NPR called. And it's just amazing how influential those places like the New York Times and NPR, because I did 2 or 3 interviews with them within a week or so. And, suddenly the book was it sold out almost immediately. It was just remarkable what can happen with that kind of national exposure.
Well,
it's the kind of thing you never dream of happening as an academic, to be suddenly cast into the spotlight.
No, but talk about some of your more recent research over the last decade, for example, your stuff associated with the Mississippi River and other things.
Yeah, most recently, really since the BP oil spill in 2010, I've moved more into community resilience and then looking at issues related to the coast of Louisiana. And I just came out with a book, I guess 2 years ago now, 21, called The State of Disaster, which is about the chronic situation that's seeing our coast disappear due to sea level rise and sinking land. And the state's massive $50 billion plan to try to stabilize the coast, to protect and preserve it and restore it. But they don't really take people into consideration. So it was partly a historical geography of how we got here, how this plan came to be, based on what was known and the really spectacular science work that brought about our understanding of this process, but how the state has now really neglected to put people in the foreground of their planning. It's all about preserving the biophysical environment, and to a lesser extent to preserving major cities to provide flood protection against storm surge for those big cities. And it really neglects many of the other people in the region whose livelihoods will be disrupted, commercial fishermen, and those kind of people whose livelihoods are going to be disrupted by the restoration plans and projects.
It's a very, very sad state of affairs. Unfortunately, there's not adequate dialogue that's taking place between the stakeholders in the entire enterprise of coastal protection / conservation / management. And like I mentioned earlier, in Louisiana, the changes are occurring quite rapidly, perhaps more rapidly than seen throughout the historic record, really.
Yeah, and Louisiana always likes to claim we're number one at something, and and this is probably one that's a legitimate claim, is that we have the highest rate of relative sea level rise, which is the combination of the actual rising of the seas and the rate of the sinking of the land. So coastal areas are going underwater faster, and that means we have 50, 60 mile swath of marsh that's no more than 4 or 5 feet above sea level. In good conditions. When you have a storm surge, it's all underwater. When you have a high tide and northbound winds or southerly winds blowing to the north, you have roads go underwater. And when a storm comes in, it can blow water back up rivers and cause flooding inland where you might not have flooding otherwise because of the combination of sea level rise and surge and rainfall during a hurricane. So it's really a perilous situation for many people in Louisiana.
It certainly is, and yet the state remains very popular for investors, for tourists, for those in petrochemical industry, and unfortunately, the investors don't often enough take local communities into consideration.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that we're beginning to see quite a bit of, and this is one thing I really appreciate about my position now, is there's this spate of scholarship that's coming out that's really critical of that relationship between the petrochemical industry and climate change. Mm-hmm. And we're contributing, above our weight in terms of changing the climate and adding greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, but we're also suffering, exponentially in terms of the impacts of sea level rise. So we're contributing, and it's lapping up on our doorsteps. The consequences are lapping up on our doorsteps.
It's something that geographers are going to be imperative in contributing to problem solving and mitigating some of the damage and some of the threats. As we move forward, I'm going to ask you, Craig, to think about some of the individuals that you've worked with. You've mentioned Hilliard, you've mentioned Newton, you've mentioned Meinig. Are there others that you've worked with today, or I should say in recent years, really, that you'd like to mention that have influenced you in terms of your research and the ways in which you have examined your path in historical geography? Any students or colleagues?
Yeah, well, certainly, I go back to the people who hired me at the Illinois State Museum. They gave me a job to do something that was totally new for me. It was completely atypical for the museum. I was a curator without a collection. I was looking at hazardous waste, and they had paleontologists and archaeologists. But they gave me a shot, and they gave me a place where I could work and do research and build up a legitimate, record of scholarship. So they were hugely influential. And during that time, I point to two historians, Marty Melosi at the University of Houston and Joel Tarr at Carnegie Mellon, who really their work was very influential to me as I got started in doing hazardous waste work. They were kind of the pioneers in that area. More recently, I was brought in to do work on the BP oil spill by Bob Cates. I mean, this was just an
Okay.
extraordinary individual to work with. We did a couple of
Sure.
publications together, but he
Right.
brought me in.
I used one of those publications in my classes, actually.
Okay, that's great to hear. That's great to hear. But he, just a master of kind of going to the heart of the matter, getting right to the nub of the issue, and expressing it in really, really succinct terms. And he was just, a major figure in the field, and just to have an opportunity to work with him relatively briefly, because his health began deteriorating shortly after that. But that was really an exceptional opportunity. But then the people I like to point out most recently are my students. I dedicated my last book to my students. And just the most recent one, who wasn't mentioned in the book, but this is a woman who came from New Zealand. She's from a kind of a remote Pacific island, was doing stuff that was really not down my, pipeline. And as a result, I took her on as her advisor, and she taught me so much. And at that, many of my students have kind of forced me to kind of follow them and become and try to stay up with them as they pursue their degrees, because I come from the school that the student selects their dissertation topic, they do the research, and they teach the major professor. And I had some students who really taught me some great lessons, and people like Ryan Ojera, who's doing work on marine wildlife refuges, and Jenny Hay, who was doing work on historic preservation after Katrina, Audrey Grismore and Jessica Sims, who did work with me on community resilience, and then most recently Melanie Bean from New Zealand. I mean, they all taught me so much, and that was really one of the great pleasures of my time at LSU was having graduate students, some who kind of just ended up in my office. I didn't recruit them, but they just still shared their wisdom, their intelligence, and taught me so much.
Well, you've always had a passion for geography, and that passion is contagious. And at LSU, I'm sure that students found you to be approachable and had similar interests. And I think about this student from New Zealand. In a sense, I'm contemplating the history of geography in this regard, where the circle becomes full as Andrew Clark did his dissertation in New Zealand. Hilliard is his student. Hilliard goes to LSU. You're a Hilliard student, and there you go. Bada bing, bada boom. New Zealand
I've
again.
I've never drawn those connections. Thank you, Mike.
Well, there you go. With just a minute to go here, Craig, I'm going to ask you to think about any words of advice you might have for aspiring students in historical geography or colleagues in the field. Can you make any comments?
Well, the one thing I oftentimes try to wrap up seminars with is, or at least a class I used to teach on research methods, is don't take yourself too seriously. Have fun along the way. Do things that interest you. It's a fool's errand to think if you want it bad enough, it will come to pass. My mother kept telling me I'd have a growth spurt. It still hadn't happened. I don't think it's going to happen now at 70. But do things that satisfy your urges and your inclinations, and then be cooperative, be collegial, show respect to your colleagues, and you'll get respect back.
Craig,
and that's whether you're a historical geographer or someone else. I think historical geography is in a kind of perilous situation, and I think we have to do good scholarship. But we have to do more than that. We have to be good colleagues, good collaborators, and help our colleagues understand what historical geography can add to the equation. Because I think it could add so much as we're looking at climate change and climate change adaptation. It's an essential part of the story.
An ample body of evidence must be demonstrated for the value of the field.
Yeah. Yep.
Indeed. Craig, thank you so much for spending this time with us today. It's really been a great chat.
Well, Mike, thank you for doing this. This is really a great series. I look forward to seeing more in the years to come.
Well, thank you once again, and we'll say so long to you for now. And this concludes this episode of Conversation with a Geographer with Craig Colten. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Take care.